All right, everybody, that chapter got long, so we had to break it into two different parts. So this is still chapter 7. Stanley's blisters had ripped open and new blisters formed. He kept changing the grip on his shovel to try to avoid the pain. Finally, he removed his cap and held it between the shaft of the shovel and his raw hands. This helped, but digging was harder because the cap would slip and slide. The sun beat down on his unprotected head and neck. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he'd been aware for a while that his pile of dirt was too close to his hole. The piles were outside his 5-foot circle, but he could see that he was going to run out of room. Still, he pretended otherwise and kept adding more dirt to the piles that he would eventually have to move. The problem was that the dirt was in the ground, or when the dirt was in the ground, it was compacted, like pushed together. It expanded when it was excavated, meaning dug out. The piles were a lot bigger than his hole was deep. It was either now or later. Reluctantly, like he didn't want to, he climbed up out of his hole and once again dug his shovel into his previously dug dirt. So he's moving the pile outside of his hole. Now back to the Elia story. Myra's father got down on his hands and knees and closely examined each pig, tail to snout. That's the nose. Those are two of the finest pigs I have ever seen, he said at last. How am I to decide? I have only one daughter. Why not let Myra decide? Asked or suggested Elia. That's preposterous. Like, that's crazy, exclaimed Igor, expelling saliva, spitting as he spoke. Myra is just an empty-headed girl, said her father. How can she possibly decide when I, her father, can't? She knows how she feels in her heart, said Elia. Myra's father rubbed his chin. Then he laughed and said, Why not? He slapped Elia on the back. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig. He summoned his daughter, called her over. Elia blushed when Myra entered the room. Good afternoon, Myra, he said. You can look up Myra Minky. She looked at him. You're Elia, right? She asked. Myra, said her father. Elia and Igor have each offered a pig for your hand in marriage. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig, so I will let you make the choice. Whom do you wish to marry? Myra looked confused. That's Myra from the movie. You want me to decide? That's right, my blossom, said her father. Gee, I don't know, said Myra. Which pig weighs more? They both weigh the same, said her father. Golly, said Myra. I guess I choose Elia. No, Igor. No, Elia. No, Igor. Oh, I know. I'll think of a number between 1 and 10. I'll marry whoever guesses the closest number. Okay, I'm ready. 10, guessed Igor. Not a very good guess, is it? Elia said nothing. Elia, said Myra, what number do you guess? Elia didn't pick a number. Marry Igor, he muttered. You can keep my pig as a wedding present. The next time the water truck came, it was driven by Mr. Pendansky, who also brought sack lunches, like bag lunches. Stanley sat with his back against his pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. How you doing? Asked Magnet. Not real good, said Stanley. Well, the first hole's the hardest, Magnet said. Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others. The sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet, 12 o'clock. But he didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what they would do to him. What could they do to him? His clothes were soaked with sweat. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way of keeping you cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. He's pushed himself up with his shovel. Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom? He asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his palms to the great expanse around them. Pick a hole, any hole, he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, but first, make sure nothing's living in it. Back to Elia's story. After leaving Myra's house, Elia wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf, W-H-A-R-F.
Yep.
He sat on the edge of the pier and stared down into the cold, black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even if she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathered at the dock, and he went to see what was going on. A sign read, "Deck hands wanted, free passage to America." He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Elia was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. It wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic Ocean that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. You got to remember that, though. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Back to Stanley's story now. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You finished?" Stanley asked, enviously, so he's kind of jealous. Stanley said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, then turned and headed back to the camp compound. That's like where all the tents are. Zero's one weird dude, said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude. The weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck like it was on a spring, kind of like a bobblehead. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spit into his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. He was almost up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where the ground was because his dirt piles completely surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole because he had to lift it up and throw it. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was digging his own grave, like digging a giant hole. Back to the Elia. In America, Elia learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most important, think for herself. She and Elia often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Elia worked hard, but bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Elia was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they knew someone named Zeroni, or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Elia wasn't sure what he'd do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up a mountain and sing him the pig lullaby? After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, that's bad luck, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Elia. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. "That's so pretty. What does it mean?" Elia tried his best to translate it from Latvian to English, but it wasn't the same. "It rhymes in Latvian," he told her. "Well, I could tell," said Sarah. A year later, their son was born. Sarah named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhymed, and every night she sang it to little Stanley. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was as soft as the skies, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon, if only, if only. Stanley's hole was as deep as a shovel, but not quite wide enough at the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt, then raised it up and flung it into a pile. He laid the shovel back down flat on the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it, like spun it, and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before he could lie it flat across his hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching and felt a strange sense of pride at being able to show Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendanski that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim. You got that picture of a hole? So like he put his hands up on the top of it, and he tried to pull himself up, but he couldn't. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he just didn't have any strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Stanley," he heard Mr. Pendanski call. Using his shovel, he dug 2 footholds, so like he chopped off some dirt so he could get his foot in there. In the hole wall, he climbed out to see Mr. Pendanski walking over to him. "I was afraid you'd fainted," Mr. Pendanski said. "You wouldn't have been the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back onto his head. "All right," said Mr. Pendanski, raising a hand for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Pendanski lowered his hand and looked down at Stanley's hole. "Well done," he said. "You want to ride back?" Stanley shook his head. "I'll walk." Mr. Pendanski climbed back into the truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away. Then he took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. That's the end of chapter 7.